since our talk today tackles the issue of time as a common denominator and the fundamental aspects in the experience of both music and architecture, we have chosen to start our presentation with a brief reference to the theoretical foundations supporting our argument that both music and architecture are above all temporal arts, by which we mean that both music and architecture affect profoundly the way how we experience time and therefore shape our consciousness of time. So we will start in the German village of Tottenberg in the Black Forest, where in the spring of 1926, Edmund Husserl met his former assistant Martin Heidegger and asked him to undertake the publication of his investigations on time consciousness. This was the result of a long undertaking dating back to 1893 and that extended for approximately a quarter of a century, during which Husserl developed a thorough analysis of the phenomenon of the human experience of time. Of course, this was not the first book to tackle the problem of the consciousness of time, and in fact Husserl begins the opening chapter of his Phenomenology of Internal Time Consciousness, acknowledging St. Augustine's reflections on the nature of time in the book 11 of his Confessions, where Augustine argues that time is fundamentally bound to the human's apprehension of reality, and that therefore time is subjective, irregular, malleable, and finite. Also, Husserl had been a student in Vienna of the influential German philosopher and psychologist Franz Brentano, whose theory of intentionality, developed in psychology from an empirical standpoint, tackled the problem of the consciousness of time and constituted the foundation for Husserl's own theory. In fact, the turn of the century was marked by a broader reshaping of the consciousness of time in the different fields, as for instance in the physical sciences, where Albert Einstein's theory of general relativity of 1915 had already claimed the relativity of time, as put forward by his ideas of time dilation and of a single interwoven continuum of space-time. Also in psychiatry, Sigmund Freud, also students of Brentano, tackled the problem of the experience of time in his research, as it comes clear in the closing paragraph of his interpretation of dreams, where he sums up the shift in tense and temporality that emerges from his theory of dreams, but also in art history, where Avi Warburg's associations of images in the Mnemosyne Atlas question the temporal order of historical events and artworks, and therefore the linearity of time. So I could go on and point out other figures in these and other fields that shaped the cultural environment of the first half of the 20th century that shared the idea that time is not regular nor absolute, but instead it is elastic and man-made, and that how we divide time is our making and our doing, but for our purpose, we find particularly useful to consider Husserl's theory regarding the consciousness of time, and in particular his concept of temporal object, by which he means that every object encloses its own field of time, meaning that every object expresses the passage of time in its own particular way, and therefore has its own temporality. So if this is true, and insofar as every work of art is a temporal object, then this means that every work of art, every piece of music, and every piece of architecture all enclose its own field of time, and therefore express the passage of time in its own particular way. Needless to say to an audience of architects that this issue concerning the consciousness of time has never really been thoroughly explored, neither in the history nor in the theory of architecture until today. But in fact, in music it has. Daniel will address this topic in just a minute. But basically our goal today is to draw a comparative analysis between musical and architectural pieces in terms of temporal structure, and to demonstrate that both music and architectural pieces shape our experience of time, and that they can do so in surprisingly analogous ways.
So, before I explore the topic of time in music, it might be useful to recall that music involves not only time, but also some special type of space. And music can be understood to articulate two dimensions, space and time. And this is evident in the way one notates music in a musical score. The vertical axis denotes space, whereas the horizontal axis represents time. And musical space has to do with pitch, that is, with how one perceives certain sounds or notes to be relatively high or low. Let's hear an example, the very beginning of the Sarabande Bach's Fifth Suite for solo and cello. As in virtually all music, some sounds are perceived as relatively low, other ones as relatively high. The very last note, for instance, is a very low one. Other notes are much higher, for instance, this one here. So, notes perceived as relatively high are represented as high points in a musical score, whereas notes perceived as relatively low are represented as low points in the musical score. The musical score therefore represents a certain kind of space, a musical space, containing high and low notes or pitches. If a melody goes down, as it happens here, for instance, or here, that means its successive notes occupy increasingly low points in the musical space. And a melody is, of course, a temporal sequence of notes. In a musical score, earlier events are represented on the left, whereas later events are represented on the right. So time passes as you move from left to right. As Luis said, there are some important studies about time in music. And among them, Jonathan Kramer's The Time of Music, a book published in 1988, clearly stands as one of the most groundbreaking and influential. And basic to Kramer's book is the conceptual pair linearity and non-linearity. He identifies them as the two fundamental means by which music structures time and by which time structures music. Linearity he defines as the determination of some characteristics of music in accordance with implications that arise from earlier events of the piece. So, an earlier event happening in moment t determines a characteristic of the music happening later in moment t+1. Non-linearity he defines as the determination of some characteristics of music in accordance with implications that arise from principles or tendencies governing an entire piece or section. In this case, musical events happening in different moments all arise from a common set of immutable principles. Thus, linearity has to do with causality and process, whereas non-linearity is more holistic and deals with immutable relationships. So, Kramer's opposition, linearity versus non-linearity, connects to related binary oppositions such as motion versus stasis, Heraclitean flux versus Parmenidean permanence, temporal being versus temporal becoming. And this is actually, it should be the other way around, of course. Temporal becoming connects to linearity, and temporal being, the more static one, to non-linearity. Sorry for this mistake. So, Kramer's contribution goes much further than defining linearity and non-linearity. At the center of his book is a new typology of musical temporalities, including these ones here: directed linear time, non-directed linear time, multiplied directed linear time, moment time, and vertical time, each of which, as he says, arises from different degrees and kinds of interaction between linear and non-linear time. Many of these varieties of time emerged only in the 20th century, in the case of music, a century particularly rich in new ideas about time, as Luis mentioned. And Luis mentioned also that our basic goal today is to compare musical and architectural works in terms of their temporal structure. And we'll do that using Kramer's list of time types. Out of these 5 varieties, we'll talk about 3 today: directed linear time, non-directed linear time, and moment time. So, Kramer defines directed linear time as the temporal continuum in which events progress toward predictable goals. 2 things are important here. There is a sense of progression, and the goal of that progression is predictable. Let's hear one example taken from the first movement of Mozart's Piano Sonata in A major. I'm going to play just the first section of this movement. To draw your attention to is the fact that we feel a clear sense of closure or conclusion or repose when we reach the end of this passage. This happens because the last musical event, this set of notes, this chord, sounds fully stable. Well, let's take a closer look at how the music evolves. And first, let's note that the whole is divided into 2 parts, 2 musical phrases. This is the first one. And now, the music goes back to the beginning. It is repeating. This is the beginning of the second phrase. So, the 2 phrases start exactly alike. They end differently, however. We've already seen that the second and final phrase ends in a conclusive, fully stable manner. In music theory jargon, it has what one calls a conclusive cadence. Whereas the first phrase ends non-conclusive. If I play just the end of the first phrase, this is not conclusive because the chord we've reached here, let's call it chord A, this set of notes, feels rather unstable. Actually, this set of notes wants to move here to this other set of notes, this other chord. Let's call it chord B. But this motion does not happen in the first phrase. We are left in what one calls a suspensive cadence. It is only in the second phrase that we reach again chord A, and now chord A moves to chord B, the long-awaited and fully stable tonic chord, what one calls the tonic chord. So this means, and this is the important point, this means that we know where the music is moving to. The goal of motion is predictable. The goal is chord B, as we've called it. We also call it the tonic. The tonic is defined as the most stable note or chord, the note or chord towards which the music progresses. And this is the essence of Kramer's directed linear time, music in which events progress toward predictable goals. And this temporal sense, this particular experience of time, is above all characteristic of Western art music from the 17th to the 19th century, including Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven, among many others, what we usually call tonal music, music in which there is a tonic, a predictable goal of motion.
So, as an architectural counterpart for this concept of directed linear time, representing James Stirling's Leicester Engineering Building, designed in 1959. And we've chosen this example on the one hand because it is still deeply related to a traditional sequential arrangement of space that flourished during the architectural modernity, and on the other hand because, as we shall see later in the presentation, it served as a point of departure to break the characteristic linearity of spatial sequences in James Stirling's own work. So, for Stirling, the spatial concept that he had in mind when he was designing the Leicester Engineering Building was that of a pyramid of activity and people, by which he meant that the areas that demanded a higher density of occupation were located at the bottom of the building, and then overimposed by a number of layers of increasingly smaller occupation. So the lobby and the workshops on the ground floor, then the upper entrance, the lobby's mezzanine, and the first lecture theater on the first floor, then the second lecture theater on the second floor, then the laboratories from the third to the sixth floors, and finally the remaining offices from the seventh to the 10th floors. What is also distinctive about the spatial layout at Leicester is that the circulation scheme accompanies the pyramid-like logic of density, and it also designs a pyramid of circulation that diminishes from the base up as it goes to the top. So for instance, there is a total of 4 entrances to the building in 3 different levels, which are increasingly smaller as one goes up, meaning that the 2 largest entrances are located on both sides of the ground floor lobby, then the third entrance, already more modest, is located on the first floor at the end of the ramp, and ultimately the 4th entrance, by far the narrowest of them all, consists of a glazed-in spiral staircase for latecomers that accesses directly the largest lecture theater on the 2nd floor. Once inside the building, the circulation follows a similar logic. There are 2 staircases and 1 elevator stretching up from the bottom of the building to the 6th floor, but from then up, one of the staircases is interrupted and only another continues up. Also, the areas of circulation lobbies reduce progressively from bottom to top, and even the glass surfaces that enclose them taper in section as the building goes up, at the same time that they increasingly filter more light in, as if compensating for the gradual narrowing of space with the increasing abundance of light. So just to explain, in directed linear time there is a strong causality between the events. The narrative describes a movement towards an end that is already known from the beginning. The movement is defined by the existence of more or less stable points in the events chain, where the nature of the cadences is very clear. They're either conclusive, suspensive, or deceptive. We would argue that Kramer's concept of directed linear time fits rather well the spatial relations set at Leicester, in the sense that the linear sequence of spaces, reducing progressively as the building goes up, sets a strong sense of causality in the development of the plot. One knows clearly where to start, meaning where to enter the building, the order to follow, meaning the ever-decreasing spaces stacked vertically, and one immediately recognizes the end of the progression as soon as it arrives. In fact, one can even anticipate how the end of the sequence will be like, so high the degree of predictability along the sequence is. The rather Albertian hierarchy of building parts allows its users to know exactly where they are at every moment and how that part relates to the whole. This allows a clear remembrance of the events past and a strong sense of anticipation of those to come. At last, there is a strong feeling of completion once the end is reached, since no other space is to be expected after one lands up in the minuscule and abundantly lit floor lobby in the 10th floor.
So let's move now to non-directed linear time, the second time type Kramer presents. He defines it as a temporal continuum in which events progress now toward unpredictable goals. And my example is from Albenberg. It is the first of his 4 pieces for clarinet and piano, which he wrote in Vienna in 1913. Let's hear first how it finishes. Compared with Mozart's final chord, this is definitely a stranger, less familiar sonority. And in tonal music, chords have generally only 3 or 4 different notes. Mozart's segment, for instance, ends with a 3-note chord. This one, which one usually calls a major triad. And this is a very familiar sonority indeed, one that appears in countless pieces of music. Berg's final chord is much more complex, much more dissonant, and much less common. Only the piano has 6 different notes, which I can't even play in this keyboard because they are very high. It's like this, but in a very high register. So 6 notes plus these 2, and also very low note, which this keyboard does not allow me to play. So in total, 9 notes, and together they make up this strange dissonant sound. And well, for our purposes, what's interesting to note is that no one would expect the music to arrive at this particular point if one would hear the music from the very beginning, as we will do in a moment. This chord is not a predictable goal of motion, and one of the reasons for that is that it does not appear any time before in the piece. But the fact that the end is not predictable does not mean that there is no motion, no progression. Let's hear how the music starts quite softly and how it then becomes louder and louder. And also how it starts more sparsely with not so much activity, and then it becomes more and more dense. No doubt there is a sense of movement in this music. The music creates a sort of arc. It grows, then it recedes. And when we reach the very end of the piece, we do feel a certain stabilization. Why is that? Is it because we were expecting this particular sonority, this particular chord, as in Mozart? Certainly not. This particular chord is not predictable at all. It sounds stable simply because it is played so softly after a big climax, and because it is repeated many times. And there is hardly any repetition in the piece before. So there is a sense of movement in this music, and that the music is not at all static. There is definitely a sense of progression. That is why the music is linear. However, the goals of motion are unpredictable. Hence, the linearity is non-directed. We only become aware of what the goal of motion is when we finally get there. And whereas directed linearity was more characteristic of tonal music from the 17th to the 19th century, non-directed linearity first appears in music of the 20th century, especially in the post-tonal and even atonal music of composers such as Berg and Schoenberg. In this music, we are still moving in time, but we don't know where to anymore.
So, picking up on this concept of non-directed linearity, we would now propose looking at a later building by Sterling, the Neue Staatsgalerie in Stuttgart, designed almost 20 years after Leicester in 1977. The promenade in Stuttgart starts already in the exterior approach to the building, even before one gets into the museum, and the most distinctive feature about this promenade is that it gravitates towards the central drum space through an elaborate system of ramps, stairs, corridors, and platforms. This drum we know to be a play with Schinkel's drum at the Altes Museum in Berlin, which in its original disposition functioned as a room of lost footsteps, a central room without a designated function, from which one could access the peripheral spaces of the building. So, as one follows the promenade and goes into the drum, one is found at the major, dominant, central hierarchical space of the building, and is therefore expecting this space to be the entrance to the building. and yet it is not. That which seemed to be a functional appropriation of Schinkel's drum, the great entrance space at the culmination of the promenade, in fact is not. Sterling does indeed activate the drum with a function, but with a promenade function that revolves around the periphery of the drum, but never gets into the building, and then one is out on the other side. And indeed, the entrance, the only single entrance, is to be found at the edge of the site, in that which would perhaps be one of the least obvious places to locate such a prominent function. Now, as we heard from Daniel, in non-directed linear time, the relation of causality between the events is ambiguous, and the narrative describes a movement whose objectives are not clear, nor can they be anticipated. The objectives of the movement are only known after they appear, and if they are confirmed as such. There are also more stable and less stable points in the events chain, but the nature of the cadences is unclear. In our view, the parallels to the Stuttgart Museum are strong. In like manner, there is not a strong sense of causality between the events anymore, as Sterling seems to set up a somewhat mannerist play with the visitor's expectations. There is still a well-defined chain of events, but the relationship between these events is much more ambiguous and hence much more difficult to predict the development of the narrative. As one enters the building, the ambiguity continues. Once at the lobby, it is not immediately clear how to continue towards the exhibition galleries, for the profusion of non-hierarchical spatial events requires from the visitor a high effort to decode the spatial logic and to understand where he should go next. Like Daniel said, the vocabulary in this kind of composition tends to be less restrained as compared to goal-directed tonal music. And in fact, the very rhetoric of material and the rhetoric of sound resonance it implies express this constant reformulation of vocabulary, which results in a low predictability of the whole architectural plot. So Sterling applies an electric green linoleum floor and a carpet-clad ceiling in the lobby, which doesn't really hint at the wooden floor and plastered walls that compose the galleries, nor does it apparently relate to the travertine-clad central drum and entrance platform, neither to the ground, neither to the concrete-bound parking level, and so on and so forth. It's important to notice that this is a radically different attitude towards the setting of the promenade in Leicester, where, for instance, the palette of materials used, namely the brick, the tiles, the concrete, and the glass, was ever the same, and which varied in accordance to the gradual decreasing of spatial volume and in direct proportion to the gradual increasing of light volume in the spaces. Similarly to Leicester, there is still a well-defined order of events in the sense that it is clearly defined where to enter the building, the order of events to follow, and where to end the spatial sequence. But unlike Leicester, the degree of predictability is now very low and marked by a strong sense of spatial ambiguity. The Albertian logic of part to whole doesn't fit the spatial logic any longer, and the spatial hierarchy has been broken. It is not clear for visitors where they are in every moment, and it is therefore much more difficult to perceive or to remember past durations, and virtually impossible to anticipate future durations, therefore shaping a completely distinct field of time.
So the two time types we've been discussing are essentially linear, that is dynamic, not static. Let's move now to a more static, essentially non-linear temporal type, moment time. According to Kramer, this time sense arises when the music is made out of a mosaic of moments, and a moment is defined as a self-contained, quasi-independent section set off from other sections by discontinuities. Well, for consecutive sections of music to be heard as moments, there has to be no connection or transition between them. If there were transitions leading section A to section B, then section B to section C, etc., one would feel a linear sense of progression. If there is no connection, no transition, but rather a discontinuity, a kind of cinematic cut between consecutive and contrasting sections, they are heard as moments. In moment time, the music is conceived as a series of almost independent episodes, moments. Well, there are not many examples of this temporal type in Western music before the 20th century. Like non-directed linear time, moment time is also essentially a modern creation. Instances of moment time can be found in many pieces of Stravinsky, Messiaen, Stockhausen, among others. Let's hear the beginning of Olivier Messiaen's Oiseau Exotique, a piece he completed in 1956. Notice in particular how very short and quite diverse moments succeed one another without any transition mediating them, and each one of them sounding almost self-sufficient. And the new moment was already starting. Each moment is really incredibly short in this case, but moments can of course be much longer in other examples. Now, if moments are quasi-independent from one another, if no later moment is implied by an earlier one, their order of succession must seem arbitrary. Well, when the music is linear, either directed or non-directed, the order of musical events matters a great deal, as later events are implied by earlier ones. Now, when the music is structured as a mosaic of moments, that order is not really important. If there is an order written in the score by the composer, it must seem arbitrary to the listener. Other orderings, such as these ones, could in principle be applied without damaging too much the moment structure. And actually, in some more extreme cases, the composer determines that the order of succession of moments is really arbitrary or free. This is what's called mobile or open form. One example is Karl Heinz Stockhausen's Klavierstück 11, a piece for piano he wrote in 1956. The piece is made out of 19 different sections or moments, not all of them of the same duration. Shorter ones are around 5 seconds, longer ones around 30 seconds. And all 19 moments are reproduced in a single gigantic sheet of paper. The pianist is asked to take a look at the score and play the first fragment he happens to take a look at. He must not think beforehand which fragment he's going to start with. The choice must be fortuitous. Then he is asked to do the same and play the second fragment that he happens to take a look at. He continues like this until he has played the given moment 3 times. Then the piece finishes. And there are, of course, many different possible orderings of these 19 moments, according to Stockhausen's rules. More than 1 million, probably. And each performance will use a different ordering.
So, to conclude and to draw a parallel to the concept of moment time in architecture, we will finish with another building by James Stirling, this time one of his late career, the Wissenschaftszentrum in Berlin, designed in 1979. The design concept of the Social Science Center was to separate different institutes into separate pavilions, where each of them would have a plan form and an outer shape that referenced a historical architectural archetype. In the final scheme, the assemblage was composed by a semicircular theater, an hexagonal tower, a stoa, a church, a castle keep marked only in the corner garden, and a pre-existing 19th century building. Now, as we've heard from Daniel, in moment time the narrative events are independent from one another, and there is no causality between them. There is just no linearity at all, and the spatial narrative is in fact composed by a mosaic of independent moments, each of them relatively static in itself. There is no transition between the moments, but instead cuts that produce discontinuities and contrasts. There are no cadences, but instead interruptions. There is no beginning, but a start, and there is no end but a stop. Ultimately, it seems that the order and the number of the events is not necessarily fixed, and that the composition tends towards the open form, and all these characteristics seem to fit rather well with Wissenschaft Center. Another significant, unlike any other building by Sterling, it has 5 independent entrances, all equivalent in importance. This means that for the first time in a Sterling building, there is not a single defined way of getting into the building, but instead a number of them. Once inside, even though there is a continuous internal gallery connecting the pieces, the spatial order of the events seems to be reinvented every time the users cross the central garden at the ground floor level to move from one pavilion to the other, and for the same reasoning, it is not defined either where to exit the building as if the composition was tending towards an open form. In the Social Science Center, there is just no causality at all between the parts, and the spatial narrative of the building seems indeed to be best bracketed by the idea of a start and a stop, than by that of a beginning and an end. The Albertian hierarchy of part to whole is not even broken, but made into a mosaic. Not only is it impossible to anticipate the further developments of the plot, nor its durations, as it even becomes difficult to build a memory of those pasts, since in the Social Science Center, even the past is ever different. It is the end of the narrative structure of the building, we would argue, insofar as the set of related functions that made the narrative structure necessary is not related anymore, and therefore there is no need for an ordered sequence any longer. The need for circulation as a device to connect such functions has become obsolete, and it seems to open room for an architecture that fosters a never-changing perception of time.
So, to sum up, our analysis seems to show that both music and architecture can shape our experience of time in significant ways, and also that each work expresses its own temporal logic of view of time. For instance, some works, both in music and architecture, have a more dynamic temporality in which events follow according to a specific, necessary order, Mozart's sonata or Sterling's Leicester building. Whereas other works, as they are made out of almost independent objects, create a more discontinuous, fragmented temporality, in which the order of events seems or is arbitrary. And actually, both in the Berlin building as well as in Stockhausen's Klavierstück, there are many possible orderings and many possible entrances. In the first cases, Mozart's and Leicester's, there is a high degree of predictability in the chain of events, and hence a clear sense of anticipation can be formed. This is what Kramer calls directed linear time. And in the Berlin and Stockhausen case, there is a very low degree of predictability in the chain of events, and it is virtually impossible to anticipate what the next moment will be. And this is Kramer's moment time. Which, and of course, Albenberg's piece for clarinet in Vienna and Sterling's Stuttgart building can be thought of as an intermediate case, as there is a dynamic, progressive temporality, but without a predictable goal, meaning that it is hard to anticipate where we are going to. This is Kramer's non-directed linear time. And Kramer's list of time types therefore seems able to characterize the temporal structure not only of music, but also of architectural works, and reveal, we hope, interesting parallels between